I'm Landon, your Kentucky storyteller. And this is the Commonwealth Podcast, the stories of the wealth of life that Kentuckians possess through common means. Today I have with me Mr. Jameson Cable, and due to COVID-19 and the distance between Jameson and I'm actually conducting this interview via Zoom. Nevertheless, Jameson, thank you for joining us today on the Commonwealth Podcast. How are you today, brother?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I'm very interested in to see what good stuff you get, what good stories you get from Kentucky, because it's full of them.
Sure, certainly. Well, before we begin with your story, I want to let all of our listeners know that they can connect with the Commonwealth Podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Commonwealth Stories and on Twitter at Seawealth Stories. And we recently did a giveaway on social media, and we'll be doing such periodically. And you'll also be able to receive up-to-date information on upcoming episodes and get a behind-the-scenes look at what we do for the show. So be sure to head on over to our social media channels and connect with us there. Jameson, thank you again. We're here to tell your story, and I want to facilitate the telling of your story. So let's begin by having you introduce yourself to our audience. Why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, your family, what you do, where you live, and so forth.
Well, thanks again for having me. I live in Kentucky. I've lived in Kentucky my whole life. I grew up in Rockcastle County, and I currently live in Lincoln County. But if you're being technical, I live about 3 miles from where I grew up. So I've kind of never really left. I went to college, of course, in Lexington and Richmond. I did, spend time away from my hometown and so forth. But I've kind of gradually came back. I teach at Crab Orchard Elementary. I've been teaching, this will be starting my 8th year teaching. I went to EKU. I graduated from EKU. And I have a podcast, Kentucky History Podcast, where we talk a lot about Kentucky history, of course. And that's it. I have 3 kids and a dog. I've been married for 10 years now. So
wow,
that's the brief part of it.
Sure. Now your kids, how old are they?
My daughter just turned 8, Eliana. She turned 8 on the 21st of July. Right. Maxim is 5, and he will turn 6 in December, and Cambry is 1. So it's a wild party. It's not been a vacation this summer.
So needless to say, you guys have your hands full.
Yes. And then we got a dog. Like 2 weeks ago, we're like, hey, let's get a dog. And it's a puppy. It's not just any dog. It's a puppy. So
right. Recently, my wife and I took in a stray golden retriever that was just in our neighborhood. And we sometimes regret just taking in that dog. We love him, but there's just a lot of stress that comes along with him.
Yes.
So you said that you're from Rockcastle County, born and raised in Rockcastle County, correct?
Yep.
Now, for those that may not be aware, Rockcastle County is just south of Berea, and yes, I guess we could say southeast of Danville. Now, some consider that to be Eastern Kentucky. Would you agree with that? Talk about that and share your thoughts there.
I don't know. It's funny, on the podcast, my co-host, Mr. Pope, he talks about that how big of an Eastern Kentucky guy I am, and yet Rockcastle is literally on the line. It's literally on the line. I-75 goes right down it, and I kind of describe it as you got on the east side of I-75 is like Livingston and more of the mountainy terrain in the county, but on the west side you have more of the hills, more of the knobs, more farmland. And I lived on the west side. I lived as west as you could get in Rockcastle. I was right next to Lincoln County. So I don't know. I guess I'm Eastern Kentucky. I got a 606 area code.
Okay. Now, I-75 goes right through Rockcastle County. Is that correct? Okay. Yep. So perhaps half of the county is in Eastern Kentucky and half the county is in more central Kentucky. But no, I tend to look at it as more central Kentucky, but I can see geographically how you could be thrown into the Eastern Kentucky area.
Now, my wife's from Hazard, and that's
Eastern Kentucky.
This is very Eastern Kentucky, yes. So I got that connection, but see, we get WLEX, we get WKYNT, or KYT. Right. We don't get any of the Eastern Kentucky news channels or anything like that. I would loop it in, I guess, to Central Kentucky, South Central if you want to be technical.
Sure. That's an interesting, I guess, consideration that you're from Rockcastle County, which some consider to be Eastern Kentucky, but your wife is from Hazard, which is truly Eastern Kentucky. So let's talk then about the culture. I mean, what are the differences between the culture of where you grew up and where your wife grew up?
Well, that's interesting. I'll say there's a few differences, and I'll start with sports is the biggest difference.
Right.
Rockcastle is we were always more of a football school.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say there's plenty of good football schools in Eastern Kentucky as well as across the state. That I guess if you look at our school history, football was more of the dominant sport or it had more success. Now, if you
Right.
go to Hazard in Perry County, basketball rules and
Sure.
it is intense. I went to a Hazard in Perry County basketball game and I was blown away about how intense it was. There was a fight.
Oh, wow.
A coach got arrested. It was crazy. My wife was like, it's like this every time. Every time Hazard and Perry County play each other, it's just
Sure.
intense.
So that's
So
a rivalry for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the gym was it had circle seating all the way around. Our gym in high school was just like two bleacher sides. That was it. It was just different. That's a big sports difference, I guess. Another thing I noticed whenever I was driving around, my first time I was going down to Hazard, was that everybody had a truck, and it was a big truck with dualies. Everybody, everything was there was like coal dust and all that stuff around. And here I was with my little sports car driving around.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Right. Do you see any cultural differences between your family and her family?
Not really.
Not really?
My
Wow.
my wife talks a lot about how similar my grandma is to her grandma,
Hmm.
and just about how family values and family connections is very important throughout the state, if you want to say that way. But one
Right.
other thing that's kind of I thought was odd, and maybe you have a verdict on this as well, but do you ever eat chips with your pizza?
Oh, yeah. All the time. Every birthday party, every social gathering where there's pizza, it's
Yeah.
barbecue chips or plain potato chips. Which one would you like, Jameson?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I never did that. I did not see that or notice that until I went to my wife's family's get-togethers. She was like, "What kind
Sure.
of chips you want?" I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Are we having pizza?" And she's like, "Yeah, you got to get chips with your pizza." I was like, "I've never had chips with my pizza. I don't get it." But I think that's an Eastern Kentucky thing, chips and pizza.
Perhaps.
Uh,
Perhaps.
yeah.
So for someone like me who
Mhm.
grew up in Eastern Kentucky, not Hazard, but Lawrence County, which is
Mhm.
a fair ways north of Hazard area, and for others who may not really be familiar with Central Kentucky or Rockcastle County, what was it like for you growing up in that Central Kentucky area in Rockcastle County?
Probably just like a lot of places. Everybody knew everybody. The county was small, population small. I mean, I think there was maybe 800, maybe 900 kids in the high school when I graduated. My
Sure.
class was, right under 200, not much. It's only 3 elementary schools. And, we cruised town. That was one of the cool things we did. We would cruise around town and,
Yep.
if you wanted to go to a movie, you had to go to somewhere else or out of county, which kind of stinks whenever you look at like older history. If you go back 100 years, every small town in Kentucky had a movie theater, they had a rolling rink, they
Right.
had all these things you would consider, good entertainment, keep the youth busy and so forth. But now all that stuff's gone, and there was not much to do. We went to the rock quarry, uh, you know, Hummel. There's a place that's haunted in Rockcastle
Oh, wow.
called
Okay.
Mullen Station. So, we would go down there, you drove around, and that was as far as things in the county besides going to a high school sporting event, there's not much. And that's kind
Not
of
much to do.
yeah,
Right.
that's one of
We
the
had
sad
a
parts.
theater it was an older theater where
Hmm.
I grew up in Louisa, and
Hmm.
I believe it was recently renovated. I think it was called the Garden Theater, but obviously
Hmm.
they did movies and such there. But I remember growing up, one of the rumors, I mean, throughout my childhood and even into high school before I graduated, was that Louisa was getting a movie theater. And I don't know if that's the case for a lot of places around the area. Maybe it was wishful thinking or
Yeah.
a hope that we had, but it was always, Louisa's getting a movie theater. Louisa's getting a movie theater. And not once, still
That
today, we don't have a movie theater
is.
in Louisa. So thinking back on your childhood and growing up, what did a typical weekend look like for you and your
Oh,
family?
I guess for the whole family, we would, if there was a sporting event, me and my older brother both played high school football. My younger brother didn't, but in my high school time, that would be what we would do. We'd go to a football game in the evening or on Friday night. Saturday would be more depending on what's going on. It could be a family get together. Lake Cumberland is really close. That's another
Yeah.
place that we went to. If it was summertime, my aunt and her family oftentimes did a camping like at Boonesboro and Levi Jackson, other places that you can go camp to. So, that would be an option. That was it. There was also, I mean, if you're looking at me as a high schooler, of course, I would, try to go swimming somewhere. There is a country club in Rockcastle that is
Okay.
Cedar Rapids. It still operates today. It's pretty small, but they golf, which I don't know about you. I'm terrible at golf, and I never got the golfing bug, so that didn't happen.
Not something that interests you. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that this is pretty comical. When I was in middle school, me and my buddies really all liked wrestling. And
Okay.
so in middle school, my dad built us an entrance ring. It originally was a tree house, and we would go out there and wrestle. We would have fireworks for entrances, and we built on like an entrance ramp. Really got invested in the backyard wrestling.
That's
And
wonderful.
it was me, my family, my cousin. We had another family we went to church with, and like all they had 4 boys, and all of them participated. And then we'd have friends too. It became a pretty big ordeal, a pretty big orchestrated event.
Wow.
We had fans, like 4 or 5 that would come and
4 or
watch.
5 fans, of course.
Yeah. So it was pretty fun. It was pretty wild, I guess. That's the thing, I guess, in the rural towns in Kentucky, you make your own entertainment for sure.
Right. Yeah, you make it up as you go along if there's nothing there, of course. So thinking about growing up, who was your biggest influence?
Probably my mom and dad, of course, and my grandma. Well, my paternal grandma, my dad's mom, probably had the biggest influences. And my older brother, of course. That was probably the people who influenced me the most. My mom is a teacher. She's retiring this year. About November is when she's going to retire. So there's that. She was definitely probably the most professional influence or overall life influence. Obviously, moms typically are. She is also big time into genealogy and like history. So that I remember us going to Pineville when we were young to go to like Chain Rock and just tour. That's the one thing we did oftentimes. We would just go places, Boonesboro, Fort Harrod. So a lot of influence, of course, is from her teaching, becoming a teacher for one, and then definitely the history aspect as well. And of course, my dad had influence because, he's your dad and, taught me a lot of stuff that you get, a lot of good dad advice, I guess.
Right.
Some of it's appropriate to say on here. Some of it's probably not. So,
Okay. So obviously those influences early on are still with you today. You mentioned your mom obviously influencing you perhaps to become a teacher, and then even the podcast and being a historian, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But did you pick up any influences along the way in college and as you began your career?
That's a pretty good question. Because of course, I don't know about you, but if you went to college or not, but when I went to college to be an engineer.
Okay.
Because in high school, I took a few classes, and they were real fun. They were like CAD classes,
Sure.
engineering classes, and they were a lot of fun. I really liked the teacher that I had, Mr. Green. But that really got me. I guess, I was a senior in high school. I had to make a decision of what I was going to do. So I decided to go to school and go to be an engineer. But then I took calculus in college. I was like, man, I don't know if I want to worry about all this stuff, if I'm having to do all this math and engineering and math go hand to hand. So
sure.
My mom had always encouraged me to be a teacher, and that's when I changed to be a teacher. But I did take a history class in college, like most people do. But the teacher I had, and I've not been able to remember his name for a while now, but he was very passionate about teaching and history in general. And like I've just really enjoyed his class. He was very energetic and just had a passion. You could tell he had a passion for history. And I learned so much, and it was such an easy class because it was so engaging. And, becoming a teacher, that kind of definitely influenced me. You want to engage. And then, of course, when I got my job at Crab Orchard, Mr. Pope was teaching, and he taught history. And that's kind of how the podcast got started, is me and him would be sitting at recess talking about whatever history that it was on his mind, or I've had questions, of course, as well. And a lot of influences, of course. My grandmas, of course, both my grandmas always talked about the past growing up in Rockcastle, and those old stories, man, they're always really good.
Sure. Well, we're going to get to the podcast in just a moment, but I want to spend just a few more minutes here talking about your life growing up, because after graduating Rockcastle County High School, you attended, I believe, Eastern Kentucky University. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your education experience, why you chose to go to Eastern and so forth.
Well, first I went to My older brother was living in Lexington, so I moved to
Mhm.
Lexington and into his house. And I went to, it was LCC, Lexington Community College, but now it's KCTCS. I went like 2-3 years there.
Mhm.
And then I met my wife at the time, and she was going into the speech pathology program at Eastern. And so then I ended up transferring and moving to Eastern. Eastern, of course, is a big elementary education or education in general college.
Right.
So I went there, and the college experience is one that's pretty enlightening, I guess would be a good way to say it.
Sure.
Uh, that might be the most positive way to say
Probably, yeah.
it. But just going there, and I have a feeling that everybody should not necessarily go to college, but leave your parents for some time and kind of be on your own. You'll build a lot more characteristics in a person. And I met a lot of good friends while I was working in college. I was a valet at Central Baptist Hospital
Okay.
there in Lexington for many years. Drove a lot of cars, but met a lot of cool people and a lot of unusual people and different people. And I think the more people you meet throughout life, the more understanding, I guess, would be the best way you could say it. The
Sure.
more understanding you are.
So remind us again where you teach.
Crab Orchard Elementary, which is in Lincoln County. It's in the eastern part of Lincoln County, right next to Rockcastle County. And I teach 4th and 5th grade reading, which it's complicated. I'm a 5th grade homeroom teacher, so I'll primarily have 5th graders, but I do have 4th graders for a few hours of the day. And at this point, I don't know what's going to happen as far as this
Right.
coming up year goes. So, and writing, I do 5th grade writing as well. So, that's the teaching career, a part of it.
Sure. Now, I suspect that the culture in Lincoln County, being so close to Rockcastle, is not much different.
No, pretty
Yeah.
much hand in hand. It's the same.
Right.
Lincoln
Right.
County is bigger. About 8,000 more population wise. A little bit more industrial too, but really about the same. Rockcastle has Renfro Valley. It's got the Kentucky Music Hall of Fame
Right.
there. But Stanford is super historical. It has a lot of Lincoln County has a lot of historical aspects as well. Pretty much the same. I mean, there's not.
Sure. Now, what made you decide to teach elementary school? Why 4th and 5th grade instead of maybe younger kids or high school?
Well, as far as middle school and high school goes, the big thing is they all start getting taller than me, and I figured it'd be better if I, And another thing with middle school, I subbed middle school while I was getting my degree. Middle school vibe I just did not like.
Didn't like it.
Kids are kids at any age, but that time of life, I really didn't want to have to deal with that every day.
Sure.
Well, high school, you have to have a bit more of a specific subject, which I would love to teach U.S. history or, Kentucky history in high school, or just history in general in high school. That'd be a lot of fun. But I guess I was just drawn more toward elementary because I've always been good with kids, been able to talk to them, entertain them as well. And my mom, of course, was an elementary school teacher. So that just naturally went that way. Now, as far as teaching kindergarten, 1st or 2nd grade, 3rd grade, or any of those grades, I'm qualified to do it. But
Okay.
if I had the choice, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't, right?
But when I first got out of college, if somebody offered me a kindergarten spot, of course I'd be like, yeah, I'll take it.
Sure.
But man, little kids are a handful.
Well, you've got 3 of your own at home.
Yeah. And the preschool teachers, kindergarten teachers, they are saints and need
They're
to be
wonderful.
honored yes, because I coach U6 soccer with my son. And I mean, it's only like 10 kids, but man, it is. I mean, I'm only out there for 30 to 45 minutes, an hour if it's a game, but man, they are hard to wrangle. And
You're exhausted afterwards, I'm sure.
Yes. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I was scrolling through your Facebook page this morning because I was
Mhm.
reviewing the questions that I wanted to ask you, and just to see if there was anything else interesting that perhaps I could throw your way. And I stumbled upon a very intriguing photo of you recently preaching at a church.
Oh,
And
yeah.
being a pastor myself, of course, I am just intrigued to hear about how you came to that opportunity, and more broadly, if you could share with us how faith has shaped your life in Kentucky.
Well, I would say that I came across that opportunity pretty much by force.
Okay.
We go to the Stanford Church of Christ, and it's a small church at the max. Our biggest days are like 55 people. And our typical preacher, preaches on 3 out of the 4 Sundays of the month.
Mhm.
And he lives in London, so he has to travel and this and that. I guess you could call him a traveling preacher if you wanted to kind of be historical. 1 Sunday out of the month, sometimes 2 Sundays, depending on if there's 5 Sundays, we have to have other people in the congregation preach. And, we have I guess if you want to call it a bullpen of about 5 or 6 people who can preach. And the first time that it happened, of course, was one of those times that everybody's schedule pretty much was taken. And I was down on the list and they were like, hey, you're going to have to preach. We're all going to be gone and so forth. And I was like, all right, I can do that. And then, of course, after the first time, then you're in the cycle. And so it becomes more
once,
of a day.
Once you do it once, you're in, right?
Yeah. So, and I'm a deacon at the church too. So it was one of the,
Great.
that was one of the things my buddy Daniel that I've mentioned, who's on the podcast from time to time. He's like, you want to be a deacon? And I was like, sure. And all this and all that. Well, he said, the one thing is, man, if you are a deacon, you can't say no if we ask you to preach. I was like, okay, all right, I got it. So that's how that all got started. And I may average 2 or 3 sermons, if you want to say it that way, or nights, teaching class or filling in a year. I mean, it's not that much. Whenever I'm needed, of course I'll do it. But to the second part, as far as like, how has faith shaped my decisions, guided me? I mean, it pretty much guides me about every day. I went to Providence Church of Christ my entire life. My family has been going to that church, for maybe 100 years or so.
Sure. Long time.
A long time. It's one of those things that as you grow up and you're around it a lot, it really becomes embedded in your decision making and your attitude towards life. And that, I mean, I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't went to church all my life in that aspect. Your trajectory could have easily changed, or mine. I mean, it's got me where I am today, being faithful and having a peaceful mind, I guess, will take you a long way.
Excellent. Well, you're not only a teacher and now just recently discovered a deacon, but you're also a historian. And you and I have had that discussion before about how weird it feels for you to be called a historian. But you're a historian and a podcaster. So here's your opportunity, brother, for you to tell us about your podcast and talk a little bit about that adventure that you're involved in regularly.
A shameless plug, I guess, if that's what.
There you go.
And it is odd. Like, somebody had called me a historian, a local historian. I'm like, I don't have a degree or anything in history or anything. I wouldn't call myself a historian. But when I think about it in a big sense, having a piece of paper doesn't really make or break you on any kind of.
No, you're 100% correct there.
But as I said, my mom had a big influence on the history and becoming a teacher. As I've went throughout life, I've just been intrigued by listening to stories. Hanging out with my dad and his buddies, they always told stories, and some of them not appropriate, but they told stories. And my grandparents always told stories, and just being connected to history. As I said too, going around young, going to places, historical sites was always a fun thing for me and my brothers. But the big thing with the podcast got started with me and Mr. Pope at Crowd Orchard teaching 5th grade. And he was just he has such a deep knowledge of Kentucky history and U.S. history. He taught social studies so much. And we would just talk, get into these big discussions about Daniel Boone or Simon Kenton or lesser people, William Whitley and Benjamin Logan. And we would really get into these, talks, and they were just so, I guess, fun, for me, for sure.
Right.
They were a lot of fun. Him as well. And then about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, he retired. And as most retired people do, he doesn't come to work anymore and doesn't come to recess and talk to me.
So you had to fill that void in some form or fashion, it sounds like.
Yeah. So this will be, I guess, coming up on a year of doing the podcast, but last summer, I approached him. I was like, man, would you be interested in starting up a podcast? And I'll tell the story on him. He had no idea what I was talking about.
I knew that was coming. Most people have no clue what a podcast is.
And, so after a few phone calls and kind of laying out, hey, this and that, he still didn't know what we were doing. But it's funny. He said, so is this like, are we recording this like with a video camera? And are we going to be like, he's like, I had an idea of us like looking around for stuff. And I was like, no, man, no, that's not what it is. It's just us recording audio and talking about. I was like, it's like a radio show. And that's about the best sell I can give to people. It's like, it's just a radio show on your phone.
Sure.
and so forth. So he hopped on and was like, yeah. And I mean, since then, I mean, we've both been pretty gung-ho. Of course, with COVID stuff, kind of hindered us a little bit from getting together because he's not that tech savvy, and getting on Zoom is not easy for him. And I can vouch
Right.
because oftentimes when he was in the room across from me, he was asking me for technology needs. Hey, what is this? What is this? So that was kind of how we got started. And since then, I mean, people seem to enjoy it. You know, we get messages telling us about how much they enjoy the podcast and how much they like it. And to get a little more deeper, since Mr. Pope was a social studies teacher for 30 some plus years, when we would talk about history, it was always stuff I didn't know of or I hadn't realized. And that was kind of the basis of the podcast, is let's talk about some stuff that people don't know. Because I mean, most people who went to school in Kentucky, went to elementary school, they had a 5th grade social studies class, and
Mm-hmm.
they talked about Daniel Boone for a little bit. They may have talked about Simon Kenton. There's probably a few other, they talked about probably horse racing for a little bit, and there's just not as much. You know, they talked about the basics, and there's so
Right.
much more that Kentucky offers as far as history goes. And, you know, you can even say the nation goes. You know, Kentucky was a big bridge for immigration for many years.
Sure.
And a lot of people west of Kentucky can connect back to Kentucky because their family came from Kentucky at one point, or lived there in some sort of manner. So there's this
Right.
big void, I guess you could say, of Kentucky history that, you know, we want to get out there. We want people to know about. And I mean, you know, I could ask you, do you know who John C.C. Mayo is by chance?
Actually, I believe I just listened to that
Oh,
episode.
okay. Well, then,
Yeah.
there you go. You know, and then there's people like that that, like, no idea who he is. John G. Feed, you know who that is?
I don't know who that is. That name sounds familiar, but I'm not sure.
He was a big abolitionist. He founded Berea College. I mean, a very like
Okay. Okay.
honorable Kentuckian. And we got an episode coming up about him. You'll get to here in a few. But
Sure. Now, Mayo was involved in East Kentucky coal mines, right?
hmm
If I'm not
hmm
mistaken.
yeah. And to go back to your original question about Rockcastle versus Hazard, is, you know, coal was not a big of a factor in Rockcastle County as,
Right.
but I mean, it's all right there on the western edge of the mountains anyway. But I mean, people did coal mine, but nothing to the extent in the eastern part of the state.
Sure.
So yeah.
So Mr. Pope is your co-host.
Yep. Yep.
And, I'll just tell my audience, I enjoy your podcast very much. And
Thank you.
actually, listening to your podcast was one of the factors that
Mm-hmm.
inspired me to do this podcast. So,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you expected that to happen to inspire others to jump on board and do their podcast, but certainly you and Mr. Pope have done that. Now, the name of your podcast is Land Between the Meadows, and you've
Mm-hmm.
added a Kentucky history podcast, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Land
So
Between the Meadows, Kentucky History Podcast.
what led you to come up with or to use the name Land Between the Meadows?
Well, we actually had a few different ideas when it came to the name of the podcast. One of them was The Dark and Bloody Ground. It talks about the Indian Wars whenever, I mean, it was a very violent in the 1770s, and the Revolutionary War was all that was going on. But we also hinted that's a pretty dark title. Maybe we should go in a different way. But the Land Between the Meadows was something that the Native Americans referred to as far as Kentucky. You know, Native Americans there wasn't really any ownership of Kentucky. It was kind of a common hunting ground. And that, you know, I say that vaguely because there was obviously Native Americans who said, you know, this is our territory. And of course they had disputes and so forth. But Kentucky means meadows. And I don't know if it's the Iroquois or the Wyandot that translates to meadows. So then as Europeans came over, it became known as the Land Between the Meadows. Well, I say Europeans come over. I mean, the natives referred to it as that as well. So that kind of became the title, The Land Between the Meadows. And then, of course, I originally had a history of Kentucky, but then I changed it to just, you know, Land Between the Meadows, Kentucky History Podcast, just to be clear on what we were doing.
Sure.
But don't want to confuse people more when you say it's a podcast.
Right. Now, you guys are coming up on a break here in August.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to take the month off. But after that, what can listeners of your podcast expect for any future plans? What do you guys have up ahead?
Well, we got a lot of plans coming up. Of course, we talk about this often whenever we're like planning stuff. Is like there's just so much to talk about. We could talk about so many things.
Could go in many different directions, right?
Yeah. But the one thing that I guess I can say, hey, this is definitely what we're doing is I've got a book I'm reading about the early political establishments of Kentucky, and it's talking about like the Danville Political Society. And like these were the people, about half the members of the Danville Political Society were a governor. They were very influential as far as Kentucky becoming a state and the laws that would come afterwards. That's one thing that'll probably be some of the first episodes. I definitely want to talk a bit more about Goble's assassination. That's a good one. Mr. Pope's working on some stuff about the Civil War. So Perryville, the Battle of Perryville, and a lot of the stuff. I mean, just the Civil War in general is a big topic for Kentucky and the nation as well. And of course, I want to get back to some Eastern Kentucky talk. I plan on reading a book or two about the coal strikes in Harlan.
Okay. Yeah.
And well, I mean, just Eastern Kentucky. It's weird. Like I said, it's like, well, Kentucky's so fascinating. Well, Eastern Kentucky is fascinating as well. And then, Central. I mean, it's all fascinating. There's so much to talk about.
Sure. Excellent. Well, so you're in Kentucky and you've grown up in Kentucky. You decided to stay in Kentucky. You and your family have, settled down here. So I just want to ask, I guess, is what do you perceive as the benefits of staying and living in Kentucky?
Well, I'll be local first. The biggest benefit of staying in and around where I grew up is babysitters. My mom, my dad.
It's a very practical answer.
Yes. They're here and are able to help. That is the biggest thing. Now, my in-laws, my father-in-law, he still lives in Hazard. My mother-in-law lives in Midway. But, just being local, knowing the area. And I lived in Lexington and I lived in Richmond, and both of those places are fine places to live. And, I guess if my life would have took a different path at some point, I wouldn't be bothered by living there. But I guess, where I am now, the biggest benefit is having family around. And, moving out of state seems like such a crazy idea, because who would you be around? If I lived in a different state, who would be there to help me? I guess it would be the big thing.
Right.
It just, having family close by really helps out, not only babysitting and stuff like that, but just having support and people you can go to. And I know you could Zoom talk with people and that, but it is different. We go to my grandma's still every Sunday after church.
Wow.
To have lunch. So it's those kind of things that my kids appreciate, I appreciate. And, being in a small community has its benefits too, because people, I know the kids that I teach at school, I know their families. I drive down the road and I can say, well, I know this person lives here, this person lives here. And so that's kind of a big benefit, especially if you look at rural versus city. Is, when I lived in Lexington, I knew who my neighbors were.
Right.
But besides that, the other people who lived in our little pocket there in Lexington, I had no idea. It's just more populated. And there's no knock on a city. A city provides just as much. I would love to go to Olive Garden or someplace like that. I would love to be able to go to a place like that easily, but everybody has their priorities. So that's the biggest thing now. There's a lot of country. There's a lot of stuff to do besides just sitting around your house, having a good sized yard and going to the creek.
Right.
Seeing wildlife too. I mean, and those are just personal pleasures, I guess.
Sure. Well, I think most people that have answered that question have said something along the same lines as you, is that, really the benefits of staying and living in Kentucky are, number one, their family, but number two, just the community. And, I'm sure every state and every area across the states has their own community and their culture and so forth. But for us Kentuckians, there's just something about being home and being around the people that we grew up with, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So what are the best traits of Kentuckians?
The best traits. Well, this is a good one. My first one is going to be loyalty. Loyalty is the best trait of Kentuckians because they are loyal to Kentucky, their family, and so forth. That's going to be, I think it's number one. I guess second one, I guess these are, of course, broad and not, obviously, you're going to find individuals who aren't loyal in Kentucky just like anywhere else.
Sure, right.
But I'm going to say honesty, too, because there's a lot of bluntness, I guess. And, some people may see it as insulting bluntness, but I find that a lot of people in Kentucky, or at least I feel like my grandma, both of my grandmas and my wife's grandma, they are all very straightforward and they tell you how they feel in a nice, polite way.
Sure. Well, Jameson, we're going to move into the lightning round. And
okay.
Yeah, so this is an interesting time. And really the challenge is that you answer these questions in like 2 or 3 words, if you can pull that off. Okay.
All right.
2 or
3 words. All right.
So number one, where is one place in Kentucky that you would take someone who had never been in Kentucky?
Oh, gosh, a few words?
A few words, brother.
Oh gosh, they never been to Kentucky. The Moon Bow, Cumberland
The moon
Falls, I
bow.
guess. Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the most unique thing they could get in
Sure.
Kentucky. So I guess if I had to pick one, sure.
Right, right. Well, as we talked earlier, my wife and I recently went to Cumberland Falls, and we didn't go on a date where you could see the moonbow, but
Mhm.
we want to go back and see that. I'm not sure if it's common or not, but when we were there, we did see a rainbow at the bottom
Mhm.
of the waterfall, and that was a
Oh,
beautiful
cool.
sight.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the falls is an incredible place, Cumberland Falls. So, next
Yeah.
question: how would you describe Kentucky to a person who had never been to Kentucky?
Uniquely beautiful, I guess.
Uniquely beautiful.
Definitely.
Great. I like it. So, if the first question was difficult, I imagine for you, this is going to be even more difficult. Okay. So, here we go. Prepare yourself. What is the most memorable moment in Kentucky history?
Oh, goodness. Oh,
Perhaps that's a
uh,
difficult question for a
it is.
historian, right?
It is. I mean, the most unique moment would be the Goebel assassination because I don't think, pretty sure no governor in the country was ever assassinated but him.
Right.
That would be the most unique, I guess. No, I don't know. Daniel Boone coming over, I guess. That's a bit generic, but
Right.
uh,
Right.
I guess that probably changed it. He came over, man, and then people followed. So,
Sure. Do you like L8?
yes, I do. I do. I do. Now, I'll tell you a story. Back in college, I've had a few stints where I've kicked caffeine, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm not drinking any caffeine and so forth, just to be healthy and all that."
Right.
Well, I was in college, and me and my wife both were like, well, we weren't married yet, but we're like, hey, let's try to cut out some of this caffeine and so forth. And we did. But I kept drinking L8. And I would like mow the yard or do some stuff. I was, man, having an L8 after that is so good. And she's like, that has caffeine in it. I was like, no, it doesn't. It's L8. It's not. I was like, it doesn't have no caffeine. Sure enough, man, it has loads of caffeine in
Oh
it.
yeah, loads of caffeine, loads of
And I
sugar,
was like,
but it is
oh,
delicious.
it is good. I like
Have
it.
you tried the new flavors, cherry and orange
I
cream?
have not. I like cherry Sprite and that, so I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure I would like some LA cherry, but I've just not bought it. Not tried it yet.
sure. All right, final question in the lightning round. If you could live anywhere else in the world besides Kentucky, where would it be?
Cincinnati because it's right next to Kentucky.
Okay. So as close as Kentucky that you could possibly be.
Yeah, I do. I do. Oddly enough, I like soccer a lot, and Cincinnati does have a professional soccer team. So I guess that is a reason I would choose Cincinnati as well. But yeah, probably that's where.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Jameson Cable, it has been a delight and a pleasure, and I have really enjoyed this. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Well, you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. Just search at KY History Pod and it'll come up. You can find us also on YouTube. We got a Kentucky History channel where we put some videos up there. Just little short videos about famous, important historical people from Kentucky. You can email me at thelandbetweenthemeadows@gmail.com. You can find us there. You can find the podcast pretty much on about any major podcast platform: Google, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Castbox. There's a whole bunch of them. Only one we aren't on that is kind of popular is iHeart. We are not on iHeart. You can find like our first 2 episodes, but that's it. Still trying to work out getting all of our episodes on there. And that's pretty much it. We Twitter and Facebook we're pretty active on there, post up quite regularly and so forth. So check
Great.
those out. You can also, I'll do another plug here. I do a little history talk, if you want to call it that, on Family Tree Nuts genealogy program. I guess if you want, they do genealogy work. But me and the founder
Sure.
of that, Russ Carson, get on Facebook live about every Wednesday evening and just talk some history. Sometimes Kentucky related, sometimes other stuff. So you can check that out. That's about it, I guess, as far as getting out, social media and all that stuff.
Great. Well, listen, I appreciate you joining us for the Commonwealth podcast. And I want to take a moment to thank our listeners for also joining us on the Commonwealth podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you head on over to iTunes and give us an honest 5-star review. And if you wish to connect with us on social media and be updated on upcoming shows, giveaways, and more, you can follow us again on Facebook and Instagram at Commonwealth Stories and on Twitter at Seawealth Stories. We'll be releasing a new episode of Commonwealth every week, so be sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast catcher to be updated on new shows. Until next time, Thank you for joining the effort as we seek to show the wealth of life that Kentuckians possess through common means.